So, good morning again. Let's talk this morning about freedom. And that term has a lot of meanings depending on the context, but it has a very specific meaning when we talk about it in the context of the Dharma. And you often hear me talk about it with regard to the Dharma: freedom from suffering, freedom from the idea of a fixed self, freedom from reactivity, and so on and so forth. But I want to address this morning freedom more broadly, so that we don't confuse it with the way the Buddha talked about freedom and the way the Dharma talks about freedom. You know, and and I want to talk about it not in a way that has to do with doing whatever we want, acting freedom to act selfishly, freedom to cause harm to ourselves and others, because freedom without boundaries and limits is not true freedom. It is reckless. It is lacking the grounding of the values and the ethical foundation which the Buddha emphasized so strongly. So I would argue that freedom without wisdom, freedom without ethics, freedom without discernment is not true freedom. It's more like a runaway train. I'm not talking about freedom in the sense of do whatever you want or whatever feels good. Rather, I'm talking about true freedom is the freedom that comes from living a life grounded in compassion, grounded in empathy, grounded in loving kindness, grounded in sympathetic joy, the four Brahma Viharas, the four heavenly abodes. If our choices in terms of exercising what we call freedom cause harm, and those choices keep us up at night justifying them, rationalizing them, then we are not truly free. Such is not true freedom, but it's some form of pseudo freedom, or some form of popularly understood freedom. The problem with acting unskillfully is that we must expend tremendous amounts of emotional energy convincing ourselves that we've not acted unskillfully, or telling ourselves it's someone else's fault, or the circumstances are someone else's, we can blame someone else's for the circumstances. The limits and the boundaries provided by the Buddhist teachings are necessary to the freedom that he offers us. Because freedom without limits is a sure path to suffering, our own suffering and the suffering of those around us. Now, that said, let me be clear that this practice does not involve commandments and shoulds and musts as in other faith traditions. Rather, and this is one thing I love about it, it provides us with self-imposed guardrails based upon our ethical foundation to keep us on the path. But the responsibility for staying within those limits falls on us, not on some external authority. And exception, of course, if we break the law, then external authority gets involved. But part of true freedom is the freedom to establish our own limits and boundaries with guidance from the Buddhist teachings. And this is a tremendous responsibility. It's why most people never go there, because we are accountable for our own choices. We are accountable for our own mistakes. The rules are everywhere and all around us, and they're imposed externally, whether from religion, from the legal system, from cultural norms. And I'm not suggesting those shouldn't exist, and I'm not suggesting we should ignore them. But I'm suggesting that I see so many people suffer because they try and live what I call a rule-bound life, relying solely on external rules on how to live. And this quickly can devolve into cults. It can quickly devolve into authoritarianism. Those folks never have to wrestle with the moral dilemmas, but at the cost of their own autonomy, at the cost of their own true freedom. It's not how I want to live. I don't think that's why most of us are on this path. You know, think about the loss of freedom that comes with trying to comply with external rules that are often arbitrary and contradictory. This is the problem I have with commandments in other faith traditions, these rigid rules, these rigid adherence to these rules, at least we're labeled as bad or sinful or some other negative thing. I talked a long time ago about Erich Fromm, who's a 20th century psychologist who wrote a wonderful book called The Flight from Freedom. And the thesis of that book is that humankind runs from freedom toward rules because setting our own limits is a task that most people find too daunting. They don't want to go there. You know, he goes on to say in his writing that if humanity cannot live with the responsibilities inherent in freedom, it will inevitably turn to authoritarianism. And we see that in our world everywhere. In other words, we will turn to a rule-bound life governed by strict rules imposed by an external, self-interested authority where one size fits all. And I say to you, this is a loss of freedom. You know, when I was in Eastern Europe last spring and met people who grew up in the former Soviet Union, I heard the most heartbreaking stories of the type of life they had to lead, the total absence of freedom in their lives. And I also heard the joy that they've experienced since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the ability to set their own path for freedom, set their own path in their lives. Now, of course, our lives are full of rules and limits, and some are necessary. And these include inner restrictions, outer restrictions, mental, social, imaginary restrictions, restrictions of circumstance, time, truth, falsehood, conditioning, on and on and on. So how do we find freedom in this context? Simply put, we employ discernment and wisdom and the guidelines offered by the Buddha's ethical teachings to navigate our way through this quagmire. We look at these external rules and decide if they are consistent with the ethical foundations of our practice, and then we proceed. One of my teachers some time ago put it this way, quote, "The Buddha's teachings allow access to a gate of a fence around an empty field." The Buddhist teachings allow access to a gate of a fence around an empty field. When the gate is open to that empty field, we can leave the false barriers aside, the conditioning, the fear, the self-deception, and return to the field of our original spacious nature. Within these limits, the limits of the Buddha's ethical teachings, we find true freedom. This is the freedom that the Buddha's teachings offer us, not external, rigid, one-size-fits-all rules. But it is tough, it is challenging, and it requires our practice to bring all the tools of wisdom and discernment to bear on these choices. So let me leave it there, and let's get your thoughts about freedom.